Return of the Sorcerer by Clark Ashton Smith was originally published in Strange Tales in September of 1931. I had been out of work for several months, and my savings were perilously near the vanishing point. Therefore, I was naturally elated when I received from John Carnby a favorable answer inviting me to present my qualifications in person. Carnby had advertised for a secretary, stipulating that all applicants must offer a preliminary statement of their capabilities by letter, and I had written in response to the advertisement. Carnby, no doubt, was a scholarly recluse who felt averse to contact with a long waiting list of strangers, and he had chosen this manner of weeding out beforehand many, if not all, of those who were ineligible. He had specified his requirements fully and succinctly, and these were of such nature as to bar even the average well-educated person. A knowledge of Arabic was necessary, among other things, and luckily I had acquired a certain degree of scholarship in this unusual tongue. I found the address, of whose location I had formed only a vague idea, at the end of a hilltop avenue in the suburbs of Oakland. It was a large two-story house, overshadowed by ancient oaks and dark with a mantling of unchecked ivy, among hedges and unpruned privet and shrubbery that had gone wild for many years. It was separated from its neighbors by a vacant, weed-grown lot on one side and a tangle of vines and trees on the other, surrounding the black ruins of a burnt mansion. Even apart from its air of long neglect, there was something drear and dismal about the place, something that inhered in the ivy-blurred outlines of the house, in the fruitive, shadowy windows, and the very forms of the misshapen oaks and oddly sprawling shrubbery. Somehow my elation became a trifle less exuberant as I entered the grounds and followed an unswept path to the front door. When I found myself in the presence of John Carnby, my jubilation was still somewhat further diminished, though I could not have given a tangible reason for the preliminary chill, the dull, somber feelings of alarm that I experienced, and the leaden sinking of my spirits. Perhaps it was the dark library in which he received me, as much as the man himself, a room whose musty shadows could never have been wholly dissipated by sun or lamplight. Indeed, it must have been this, for John Carnby himself was very much the sort of person I had pictured him to be. Now, a knowledge of Arabic and a knowledge of the pre-Quranic, non-Jewish, non-Christian, non-Zoroastrian, non-Hindu, as people would call it, mythologies, sort of have a connection. The Cthulhu mythos, in a way that mythos in part represents what people would think of that. He had all the earmarks of the lonely scholar, with devoted patient years to some line of erudite research. He was thin and bent, with a massive forehead and a mane of grizzled hair, and a pallor of the library was on his hollow, clean-shaven cheeks. But coupled with this, there was a nerve-shattered air, a fearful shrinking that was more than the normal shyness of a recluse, and an unceasing apprehensiveness that betrayed itself in every glance of his dark-ridged, feverish eyes, in every movement of his bony hands. In all likelihood his health had been seriously impaired by over-application, and I could not help but wonder at the nature of the studies that made him a tremulous wreck. But there was something about him, perhaps the width of his bowed shoulders and the bold aquilinity of his facial outlines, which gave the impression of great former strength and a vigor not yet wholly exhausted. His voice was unexpectedly deep and sonorous. "I think you will do, Mr. Ogden," he said, after a few formal questions, most of which related to my linguistic knowledge, and in particular, my mastery of Arabic. "Your labors will not be very heavy, but I want someone who can be on hand at any time required. Therefore, you must live with me. I can give you a comfortable room, and I guarantee that my cooking will not poison you. I often work at night, and I hope you will not find the irregular hours too disagreeable." No doubt, I should have been overjoyed at this assurance that the secretarial position was to be mine. Indeed, I was aware of a dim, unreasoning reluctance and an obscure forewarning of evil as I thanked John Carnby and told him that I was ready to move in whenever he desired. He appeared to be greatly pleased, and the queer apprehensiveness went out of his manner for a moment. "Come immediately this afternoon, if you can," he said. "I shall be very glad to have you, and the sooner the better. I have been living entirely alone for some time, and I must confess that the solitude is beginning to pall upon me. Also, I have been retarded in my labors for lack of the proper help. My brother used to live with me and assist me, but he has gone away on a long trip. I returned to my downtown lodgings, paid my rent with the last few dollars that remained to me, packed my belongings, and in less than an hour was back at my new employer's house. He assigned me with a room on the second floor, which, though unaired and dusty, was more than luxurious in comparison with the hall bedroom that failing funds had compelled me to inhabit for some time past. He then took me to his own study, which is on the same floor. At the further end of the hall, here he explained to me, most of my future work would be done. I could hardly restrain an exclamation of surprise as I viewed the interior of this chamber. It was very much as I should have imagined the den of some old sorcerer to be. There were tables strewn with archaic instruments of doubtful use, with astrological charts, with skulls and alembes and crystals and censers such as are used in the Catholic Church, and volumes bound in worm-eaten leather with verdigris mottled clasps. Having trouble speaking today. In one corner stood a skeleton of a large ape, in another a human skeleton, and overhead a stuffed crocodile was suspended. There were cases overpiled with books, and even a cursory glance at the titles showed me that they formed a singularly comprehensive collection of ancient and modern works on demonology and the black arts. There were some weird paintings and etchings on the wall dealing with kindred themes, and the whole atmosphere of the room exhaled a melody of half-forgotten superstitions. Ordinarily, I would have smiled if confronted with such things, but somehow, in the lonely, dismal house, beside the neurotic, hag-ridden Carnby, it was difficult for me to repress an actual shudder. On one of the tables, contrasting incongruously with this melange of medievalism and Satanism, there stood a typewriter surrounded with piles of disorderly manuscript. At one end of the room, there was a small, curtained alcove with a bed in which Carnby slept. At the end, opposite the alcove, between the human and simian skeletons, I perceived a locked cupboard that was set in the wall. Carnby had noticed my surprise and was watching me with a keen, analytic expression which I found impossible to fathom. He began to speak in explanatory tones. "I've made a life study of demonism and sorcery," he declared. "It is a fascinating field, and one that is singularly neglected. I am now preparing a monograph in which I am trying to correlate the magic practices and demon worship of every known age and people. Your labors, at least, for a while, will consist in typing and arranging the voluminous preliminary notes which I have made, and in helping me to track down other references and correspondences. Your knowledge of Arabic will be invaluable to me, for I am none too well grounded in this language myself. I am depending for certain essential data on a copy of the Necronomicon in the original Arabic text, I have reason to think that there are certain omissions and erroneous renderings in the Latin version of Olaus Ormius. Now, there is a Book of Dead Names, which is sort of a non-Muslim Shia text that, you know, is a lot closer to what might be called by Westerners a Necronomicon. I had heard of this rare, I forget the Arabic title, or is it in Farsi? I think it's in Arabic. I've heard of this rare, well-known, fabulous volume, but have never seen it. The book was supposed to contain the ultimate secrets of evil and forbidden knowledge, and moreover, the original text, written by the mad Arab, Abdul al-Hazred. Abdul al-Hazred? I don't know which Arabic they're actually. There's different Z's, there's different H's. Abdul, you know, you got an Ein before you anyways, was said to be unprocurable. I wondered how it had come into Carnby's possession. I'll show you the volume after dinner, Carnby went on. You will doubtless be able to elucidate one or two passages that have long puzzled me. The evening meal, cooked and served by my employer himself, was a welcome change from cheap restaurant fare. Carnby seemed to have lost a good deal of his nervousness. He was very talkative, and even began to exhibit a certain scholarly gaiety. After we had shared a bottle of Malo Sauterne, still, with no manifest reason, I was troubled by intimidations and forebodings, which I could neither analyze nor trace the rightful source. We returned to the study, and Carnby brought out from a locked drawer the volume of which he had spoken. It was enormously old, and was bound in ebony covers, arabesqued with silver, and set with darkly glowing garnets. When I opened the yellowing pages, I drew back with involuntary revulsion at the odor which arose from them, an odor that was more suggestive of physical decay, as if the book had lain among corpses in some forgotten graveyard, and had taken on the taint of dissolution. Among the Jews, there have been some texts that have been found in graves, and they're not the only ones. Carnby's eyes were burning with a fevered light, and he took the old manuscript from my hands and turned to a page near the middle. He indicated a certain passage with his lean forefinger. "Tell me what you make of this," he said, in a tense, excited whisper. I deciphered the paragraph slowly and with some difficulty, and wrote down a rough English version with a pad and pencil, which Carnby offered me. Then, at his request, I read it aloud. It is verily known by few, but nevertheless an attestable fact, that the will of a dead sorcerer hath power upon his own body, and can raise it up from the tomb, and perform therewith whatever action was unfulfilled in life. And such resurrections are invariably for the doing of malevolent deeds, and for the detriment of others. Most readily can the corpse be animated if all its members have remained intact. And yet there are cases in which the excelling will of the wizard hath reared up from the death the sundered pieces of a body hewn in many fragments, and hath caused them to serve his end, either separately or in a temporary reunion. But in every instance, after the action hath been completed, the body lapseth into its former state. Of course, all this was errant gibberish. Well, things happen on the psychic and spiritual levels, don't they? Probably, it was the strange, unhealthy look of utter absorption with which my employer listened, more than that damnable passage from the Necronomicon, which caused my nervousness and made me start violently when, toward the end of my reading, I heard an indescribable slithering noise in the hall outside. But when I finished the paragraph and looked up at Carnby, I was more than startled by the expression of stark, staring fear which his features had assumed, an expression as of one who is haunted by some hellish phantom. Somehow I got the feeling that he was listening to that odd noise in the hallway, rather than to my translation of Abdul Hazred. "The house is full of rats," he explained, as he caught my inquiring glance. "I've never been able to get rid of them, with all my efforts." You know, now I sort of think of Elias Ashmole and how he, instead of working on different mouse traps, I guess maybe he did that, but he set forth charms to try to chase away rats or mice or that sort of thing. That noise, which still continued, was that which a rat might make in dragging some object slowly across the floor. It seemed to draw closer, to approach to the door of Carnby's room, and then after an intermission it began to move again and receded. My employer's agitation was marked. He listened with fearful intentness and seemed to follow the progress of the sound with a terror that mounted as it drew near and decreased a little with its recession. "I'm very nervous," he said. "I've worked too hard lately, and this is the result. Even a little noise upsets me." The sound had now died away, somewhere in the house. Carnby appeared to recover himself in a measure. "Will you please reread your translation?" he requested. "I want to follow it very carefully, word by word." I obeyed. He listened with the same look of unholy absorption as before, and this time we were not interrupted by any noises in the hallway. Carnby's face grew paler, as if the last remnant of blood had been drained from it. When I read the final sentences, and the fire in his hollow eyes was like phosphorescence in a deep vault. "That is a most remarkable passage," he commented. "I was doubtful about its meaning with my imperfect Arabic, and I have found that the passage is wholly omitted in the Latin of Olaus Wormius. Thank you for your scholarly rendering. You have certainly cleared it up for me." His tone was dry and formal, as if he were repressing himself and holding back a world of unsurmisable thoughts and emotions. Somehow I felt that Carnby was more nervous and upset than ever, and also that my reading from the Necronomicon had, in some mysterious manner, contributed to his perturbation. He wore a ghastly, brooding expression, as if his mind were busy with some unwelcome and forbidden theme. However, seeming to collect himself, he asked me to translate another passage. This turned out to be a singular incantatory formula for the exorcism of the dead, with a ritual that involved the use of rare Arabian spices and the proper intoning of at least 100 names of ghouls and demons. I copied it all out for Carnby, who studied it for a long time with a rapt eagerness that was more than scholarly. "That too," he observed, "is not in the Olaus Wormius." After perusing it again, he folded the paper carefully and put it away in the same drawer from which he had taken the Necronomicon. That evening was one of the strangest I have ever spent. As we sat for hour after hour discussing renditions from that unhallowed volume, I came to know more and more definitely that my employer was mortally afraid of something, that he dreaded being alone, and was keeping me with him on this account, rather than for any other reason. Always he seemed to be waiting and listening with painful, tortured expectation, and I saw that he gave only a mechanical awareness to much that was said. Among the weird appurtenances of the room, and that atmosphere of unmanifested evil, of untold horror, the rational part of my mind began to succumb slowly to a recrudescence of dark ancestral fears. A scorner of such things in my normal moments, I was now ready to believe in the most baleful creations of superstitious fancy. No doubt, by some process of mental contagion, I'd caught the hidden terror from which Carnby suffered. We see some of the, H.P. Lovecraft, this element in the H.P. Lovecraft stories was actually part of his thing, is that he didn't want to believe in a spiritual world, but he had these nightmarish visions that kind of, he didn't want to think that that such a thing could be possible, and he didn't want to, Christianity in particular, there's reason to think that he hated it. No doubt, by some process of mental contagion, I'd caught the hidden terror from which Carnby suffered. Oh yeah, and I mentioned before that H.P. Lovecraft had a background in comparative religion, and he thought, perhaps he could make his own. But by no word or syllable, however, did the man admit the actual feelings that were evident in his demeanor, but he spoke repeatedly of a nervous ailment. More than once, during our discussion, he sought to imply that his interest was the supernatural and the satanic was wholly intellectual, that he, like myself, was without personal belief in such things. Well, you can believe things exist without believing in them, right? Because there's a lot of beings and whatnot out there. You don't have to put your belief in them. Yet, I knew infallibly that his implications were false, that he was driven and obsessed by a real faith in all that he pretended to view with scientific detachment, and had doubtless fallen a victim to some imaginary horror entailed by his occult researches. But my intuition afforded me no clue to the actual nature of this horror. There was no repetition of the sounds that may have been so disturbing to my employer. We must have said it till after midnight, with the writings of the mad Arab open before us. Alas, Carnby seemed to realize the lateness of the hour. I fear I have kept you too long, he said, apologetically. You must go and get some sleep. I am selfish, and I forget that such hours are not habitable to others as they are to me. Well, people get used to what's not healthy, right? And they say, well, this is what's best for me. It's not, but that's just what they're used to. I made the formal denial of his self-impeachment, which courtesy required, said good night, and sought my own chamber with a feeling of intense relief. It seemed to me that I would leave behind me in Carnby's room all the shadowy fear and oppression to which I'd been subjected. Only one light was burning in the long passage. It was near Carnby's door, and my own door at the further end, close to the stairhead, was in deep shadow. As I groped for the knob, I heard a noise behind me and turned to see in the gloom a small, indistinct body that sprang from the hall landing to the top stair. Disappearing from view, I was horribly startled, for even in that vague, fleeting glimpse, the thing was much too pale for a rat, and its form was not at all suggestive of an animal. I could not have sworn what it was, but the outlines had seemed unmentionably monstrous. I stood trembling violently in every limb, and heard on the stairs a singular bumping sound, like the fall of an object rolling downward from step to step. The sound was repeated at regular intervals and finally ceased. If the safety of the soul and body depended upon it, well, what about the mind, right? Well, the mind's really a function of the body, but you know what I mean. I could not have turned on the stairlight, nor could I have gone to the top steps to ascertain the agency of that unnatural bumping. Anyone else, it might seem, would have done this. Instead, after a moment of virtual petrification, I entered my room, locked the door, and went to bed in a turmoil of unresolved doubt and equivocal terror. I left the light burning, and I lay awake for hours, expecting momentarily a recurrence of that abominable sound. But the house was as silent as a morgue, and I heard nothing. At length, in spite of my anticipations to the contrary, I fell asleep and did not awake until after many sodden, dreamless hours. And let me throw in that there was an unexplained sound in, that region where the antipole of Mecca, Jerusalem, Medina, Damascus, and the place where, that and the, where that's said to be. In the stories, that region, there was some really loud sound that they think was an animal, but they don't. It wasn't a known animal. It was 10 o'clock as my watch informed me. I wondered whether my employer had left me undisturbed through thoughtfulness or had not arisen himself. I dressed and went downstairs to find him waiting at the breakfast table. He was paler and more tremulous than ever, as if he had slept badly. "I hope the rats didn't annoy you too much," he remarked, after a preliminary greeting. "Something really must be done about them." "I didn't notice them at all," I replied. Somehow it was utterly impossible for me to mention the queer, ambiguous thing which I had seen and heard on retiring the night before. Doubtless I had been mistaken. Doubtless it had been merely a rat, after all, dragging something down the stairs. I tried to forget the hideously repeated noise and the momentary flash of unthinkable outlines in the gloom. My employer eyed me with uncanny sharpness, as if he sought to penetrate my inmost mind. Breakfast was a dismal affair, and the day that followed was no less dreary. Carnby isolated himself till the middle of the afternoon, and I was left to my own devices in the well-supplied but conventional library downstairs. What Carnby was doing alone in his room I could not surmise, but I thought more than once that I heard the faint, monotonous intonations of a solemn voice. Horror-breeding hints and noisome intuitions invaded my brain. More and more the atmosphere of that house enveloped and stifled me with a poisonous, miasmal mystery, and I felt everywhere the invisible brooding of malignant incubi. And it's interesting when you translate some of the names of entities.